Well, here we are. It's January 3rd, 2023. We're at the first 2023 meeting of the Oregon Archaeological Society. And our speaker tonight is Carl Davis. Carl and I have known one another for pretty close to 50 years. And I've always worked with Carl in the Forest Service. Carl has an extensive career in the Forest Service. He's worked on 3 or 4 national forests in Montana. He's been the regional archaeologist in Montana for about 5 or 6 years. Carl also did a lot of work at in the Forest Service here in Oregon. He worked on the Siuslaw, the Willamette, and the Deschutes National Forests. And on the Deschutes, Carl was thrown into ARPA issues very forcefully when he was quite new on the forest. So tonight, Carl is going to speak to us about Archaeological Resource Protection Act stuff. Oh, I should mention, just as an aside, Carl's the author of a prize-winning book on the archaeology of Montana called 600 Generations, The Archaeological History of Montana. It's an award winner from the High Plains Book Fair and from the SAA Popular Book Award. So congratulations on that, Carl. Okay, so Carl's going to talk to us about the Archaeological Resources Protection Act. His title of his talk is Give a Hoot, Don't Loot, Archaeological Resources Protection Act Issues. Take it away, Carl.
All righty, thanks, Jim. I'll see if I can share my screen.
Okay, we can see it. That looks great.
And I'm going to do the presenter view, but it doesn't mess with Texas. All righty,
yeah.
Well,
should be fine.
Okay, well, again, thank Jim and David and the Oregon Archaeological Society for having me speak tonight. As Jim said, I've had quite a bit of experience working with site antiquities violations in Oregon and Montana, and Jim offered that maybe it would be an interesting topic for a discussion in this wonderful series that you have going. So I said I'd be glad to do it. I worked in Oregon for a number of years, and when I moved to Montana, I retained connection with Oregon and helped on a couple of ARPA cases that came to play in the 2000s. After that, I haven't really been involved in Oregon archaeology, let alone site looting issues. So I ask your forbearance if some of my information is a little outdated or if I don't know some of the current casework that is ongoing. But hopefully any of that kind of information that can be conveyed publicly, please, during the Q&A part of it, please bring it up. I would be very interested, as I know the audience would be too. So there's kind of broadly speaking 3 kinds of archaeological site damage that archaeologists have to deal with. And these are pretty obvious, but the first one is environmental damage, which is caused by floods, wildfire, you name it. You're all familiar with it. It's now amplified, of course, by anthropogenic, I should say, climate change or global warming. Then there's human-caused damage, which is unintentional, accidental discovery, negligence, and so on. And the human unintentional piece is really the genesis of NHPA, because that's what federal law, particularly the all-important National Historic Preservation Act, is dedicated to, is how to prevent destruction of archaeological sites that can be prevented through survey, analysis, and so on. And then the last one, which will be the focus tonight, will be the intentional destruction of archaeological sites, whether it's through digging, collecting, defacement of rock art sites, take your pick. Of course, these are not mutually exclusive, as we're really seeing in the face of global climate change. After massive wildfires, Whole areas of forested landscapes are now denuded of vegetation, and once the ash and the soot washes off, it's an immediate target for artifact collectors and looters. So these actually kind of work together, but I think it's useful to kind of separate the different kinds of damage that cultural resource management professionals have to deal with in terms of taking care of the resource and being good stewards. I'm going to cover some old ground that's going to be very familiar to many, many of you, but it kind of creates the setting for ARPA that we'll talk about in just a few minutes. Of course, the first founding act of historic preservation in the United States was the Antiquities Act of 1906. It did a lot of things for bringing cultural resource management to the fore in the future. But at the time, it was kind of a low-key thing. It was really addressing the site looting and some of the damage in the American Southwest to places like Canyon de Chelly, Mesa Verde, places that are really important and cool to see. It did significantly create a permit system so that only qualified institutions and individuals could go out and actually do collecting or excavation. But way back in the day, the qualifications of those peoples that actually had permits was a little questionable. But it did create a permit system. More importantly, and what most of you widely recognize, is the Antiquities Act was used to create national monuments. The latest being our beloved Bears Ears on the Colorado Plateau in southeastern Utah. And I think 130 some national monuments have been created through this act. It's very controversial, as you know, but it's all important piece that a function that the Antiquities Act still has. The Antiquities Act also provided some measure of deterrence in terms of creating a system for fining people and imprisoning people for site looting in particular. And you can see that they're really not very significant, although $500 way back in 1906 was probably a hit on your wallet. But in truth, I think they only had 18 convictions between 1906 and 1979. I think there were 18 convictions, or at least 18 violations that were targeted with the Antiquities Act. I think it resulted in 2 sentences and $4,000 worth of fines. So it did some damage, but it really didn't address the problem. But naturally, and again, as most of you are very familiar with, a variety of other historic preservation acts were passed subsequent to 1906. The all-important National Historic Preservation Act was passed in 1966. And, you know, it came out of the social milieu of the time of anti-war movement, the environmental movement, civil rights movement, women's movement, and was part and parcel of the social turmoil and the legislation that came out of that time period. I really try and stress that National Historic Preservation Act probably wouldn't be passed today. It would be very difficult, but it came out at a unique period in the history of the United States. While the Historic Preservation Act is really cool and is the foundation of cultural resource management in this country, it really doesn't address artifact looting, defacement, and digging, and so on and so forth. So subsequently, the Archaeological Resources Protection Act was passed in 1979. That was followed by the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act in 1990. And those are the 2 key pieces of the law that really are totally focused on archaeological depredation and looting and so on. I want to mention the last 2 that I've listed, theft of government property and damage to government property, because these 2 statutes are really important too. And in the early years of ARPA, when I became involved, kind of got walked into this problem accidentally, law enforcement and assistant U.S. attorneys often cited perpetrators with both of these statutes along with ARPA, because they didn't really know that ARPA was going to work. It was untested and so on. Well, now many years later, 40 years later, ARPA now stands on its own, and people are not using sort of these backup statutes to help support antiquities prosecutions. But when I grew up doing this kind of stuff, these laws were very important, and they're important in another sense, which I'll get to shortly. Of course, all federal law depends on regulations to kind of put on the meat on the bones of how to actually get the job done. And I've mentioned two sets of federal regulations, one for the Department of Agriculture, the Forest Service, and so on, and one for the Department of Interior, which is Park Service, BLM, and so on. And not that anybody really cares what the citation is, but they're in different places, but they say the very same thing. They're the same regs. In addition to the regulations, all agencies have manuals, handbooks, and directives that also guide in very specific terms how to engage archaeologists in archaeological looting and cultural site depredation issues. There's no shortage of information there. And then lastly, the Society for American Archaeology, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, the Advisory Council, and agencies have put out a variety of agency guidelines and studies and academic publications and so on. So there's no shortage of information about archaeological site protection available. I would say, kind of as a bit of an old codger, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. And you can lead an archaeologist to archaeological site, but you can't necessarily make him read this stuff. And so a great frustration to U.S. attorneys and law enforcement officers is oftentimes archaeologists kind of reinvent the wheel and don't access this information as they should. It sometimes is a bit of embarrassment. So that's why Archaeological Resource Protection Act training is really, really important and is very active and ongoing. After the passage of the National Historic Preservation Act in 1966, then states developed their own antiquities acts, bridging off the National Historic Preservation Act, which required states to set up their historic preservation offices and so on. The acts vary from state to state. There's a couple of publications that I could shoot to folks if you're interested that show the variation in state antiquities acts. As you might expect, Oregon being Oregon, they have a very complex and detailed one. And many of you in this audience know far more about this statute than I do. But for the purposes of this presentation, the several key pieces I think are important to stress. Under the Oregon statute, it applies to archaeological resources that are at least 75 years old. It applies to public lands owned by the state, city, county, district, or municipal or public corporations. It allows surface collection on private lands with landowner permission, but interestingly, without the use of a tool like a shovel or a hoe or whatever. And then finally, it has civil provisions, which are really important, and I'll talk about in a bit. They're instituted within the context of the Oregon statute. The criminal prosecution piece sort of falls outside of this statute, but to prosecute an archaeological looter under the Oregon statute, it would fall under the general crime statutes in Oregon. But it's a pretty cool and really comprehensive. I was really surprised in looking at it again, how well written and comprehensive it is. It's a real gift for all of you to have. So the Archaeological Resource Protection Act was passed in 1979. As you can imagine, it was no easy feat to get this thing passed. I've included a little bit of the rationale of why it was passed. I've kind of given you the elevator speech here. These seem patently obvious today, but back in 1979, they were not. The first thing is that archaeological resources are accessible and irreplaceable. The sales pitch included that these resources were not just being damaged by casual hobbyists, quote, amateur archaeologists, whatever they will, but there was a real commercial attractiveness that was drawing people to these sites. And of course, much of the interest in ARPA was generated from serious looting problems in the American Southwest. In the Pacific Northwest, on the Great Plains where I work now, in the Intermountain West, it didn't really play too heavily. If you look at the history of the development of the ARPA law, it was really focused on the American Southwest and to some extent the Southeast. And it wasn't because there was not a looting problem here and a surface collection problem here, but there was not a lot of hard numbers to go to. In the Southwest, they had been collecting data about the problems of site looting for some time, and that was really important in getting this legislation passed. Of course, it recognized that the part of the elevator speech was that NHPA and certainly the Antiquities Act really don't address the problem. But the most important thing it did is it pointed out that archaeological resources, cultural resources, are as important to the public, to laypersons, as they are to pointy-headed academics and museum people and archaeologists. This is a national heritage, a public heritage that needs to be preserved and protected, and it needs to be part and parcel of our national narrative. And so those are the points which, again, seem really obvious today, but at the time it was passed, these things were repeatedly brought up in the hearings that went on with ARPA. Again, ARPA, like your Oregon law, has a lot of components, and nobody's here to listen to the dry, droll details of that tonight. But again, I kind of cherry-picked some things that I thought were important for this particular presentation. Again, ARPA has permit requirements. It has civil and criminal provisions. It has rewards for information, which is, really important. Addresses artifact trafficking and so on. When the 1988 amendments were passed, however, they added some things that had nothing to do with chasing bad guys in the wood. They turned kind of the onus on archaeologists and said, for ARPA to really work and to work well, we need public education and awareness programs. You guys need to get out and find out where the good stuff is. You're up walking around those timber sales all day, and the good stuff's down here. Don't come crying to us because these sites got looted if you guys knew that's where the sites were and you weren't doing anything about them. And finally, in the 88 amendments, they said, you guys start having to document the problem better. We got to get out of this realm of anecdotal information. You need to have a formal system, and one has been developed. So it really put the onus on archaeologists to not be in a reactive mode, but rather to be in an active mode in terms of dealing with archaeological crime prevention. And of course, this has been a difficult issue for archaeologists because they're so burdened with basic NHPA, the Great God, Section 106 compliance work, that it's difficult to carve out time to go look in these, quote, non-project areas where some of the good stuff really is and where it's being targeted by artifact collectors and looters. It's part of that stewardship piece in NHPA that says we need to take care of the resource, not just do cultural resource surveys and compliance. But it's been hard because archaeologists don't necessarily have the workforce or the funding or the resources to cover the water like this. But in ARPA and the 88 amendments, they really made a big deal out of this. And so it generated what we would call public archaeology today. My book that I wrote was Public Archaeology, just trying to explain why this stuff is important and why it should be protected and taken care of, because it isn't all that obvious to a lot of people. And again, patently obvious to us, but when you write a piece of legislation, you have to define what is being affected by the legislation and what isn't. Again, it's a little more complicated than this depiction, but basically what qualifies as an archaeological resource under ARPA is archaeological evidence. Material remains of the past, pottery, flints, sherds, you name it, we all are familiar with it. Rock art, even though it's not portable, structures. The one thing that is interesting here and can be a problem is you note that an archaeological resource under ARPA is 100 years old. So the NHPA says that a historic resource, it becomes historic when it's 50 years old. Your Oregon statute says we can go bust people if the site or the object is 75 years or older. And ARPA comes along and says, no, the threshold is 100 years or older. And, you know, we all recognize that they come from separate pieces of legislation. They're not necessarily meant to complement each other. But in fact, in the early days, this really irritated assistant U.S. attorneys that were going, what, you guys can't agree on how old is old and what's important? And I think today, people work around this rather seamlessly, but this debate between what is a significant threshold to be an archaeological resource that's important to us is kind of variable among these different, it's not kind of, it is variable among these various pieces of legislation. Of course, it's equally important to define what isn't an archaeological resource under ARPA. And of course, dinosaur bones don't count, even though, as we all know, archaeologists and paleontologists, we're all kind of put in the same mix. Cultural resources less than 100 years old, and so on, and things that are not of archaeological interest, like rocks, coins, and so on. ARPA does not chase after people out in the field collecting arrowheads on public lands, let alone private lands. This is because there has been such a history of collecting in the United States that this was a bone thrown to senators from states that collecting was really pronounced. And so we wouldn't criminalize what were hobby collectors and people that seemed like they were working in a grocery store on the weekend and coming out and collecting arrowheads. So it is indeed true that arrowhead collecting is not addressed in ARPA for that reason. The important thing to remember is arrowhead collecting is illegal on federal lands because you can get popped for collecting arrowheads under the theft of government property provisions. And a lot of the citations given are under that provision for people out surface collecting out in the Oregon desert and different places. And there's been a lot of these arrowhead collecting citations issued across the United States. And of course, you need to define what an element of an offense is. And again, these are obvious, but an archaeologist working with, archaeologists working with a special agent and then with the assistant U.S. attorney, we have to check off these boxes in order to proceed. Person digging out in the Alvord Desert, they don't have a permit, they got a problem. If they're actually knowingly digging in a site, and they're there for that purpose, and they're not digging back guano, then that checks off that box. It's a targeted archaeological resource. And the biggest thing is it occurs on federal or Indian lands. ARPA does not apply to private lands. The primacy of private property rights holds true in this country. It's one of the few countries in the world that turns a blind eye to artifact collecting and digging on private land. but that's the way it is. The big thing here is that, again, you have to go down and check the box, and you have to be able to prove these elements of a crime in order to proceed. I've been showing you different pictures, by the way. This is a looted cave on the Deschutes. You can see the gear that's recovered. There's a special agent looking in the hole in the ground where they dug. And the lower photo is a seized collection that came from a case. And you can see all the gear. I suppose you can't really pick out detail, but there's screens, there's shovels, there's picks, there's maps, there's artifact books, there's the whole shebang. And I've been on a variety of search and seizures. And, you know, this is the kit that often accompanies these kinds of folks that are out really seriously digging. They come armed and prepared, literally armed, but also they come prepared to seriously dig up archaeological sites. And I think sometimes agents in the woods or Forest Service patrols or BLM go by and they can look off in the distance and they see a bunch of guys and gals in ponytails and shorts, and they think, oh, that must be a crew that the archaeologist hired to go test a site for us. And in fact, what they are is pot hunters out digging up sites. Had that happen. A big thing about ARPA is it deals with trafficking. And so if you're at home in Nevada and you get agent knocks on the door, there's a search and seizure, and you have artifacts from Oregon that you don't have a permit for. We know they were taken from there because of other evidence. You can be busted under the artifact trafficking provision of ARPA. And this is hugely important. It was the really important element. It's not used as much maybe as it could be, but you know, this stuff, when I grew up on ARPA way back in 1980, a lot of the information was conveyed in pamphlets and artifact catalogs and magazines and a variety of different sort of print media. Of course, now all of this is on the internet. And I mean, I would invite any of you, if you haven't already, to do a Google search, you know, how to hunt arrowheads, where to buy arrowheads, and it's all right there on the internet. I'm not making this stuff up. And so those are the vehicles that artifact collections get trafficked and sold all the time. I do this. ARPA has criminal penalties, and you think, well, how the heck can you tell what's the value of a looted archaeological site? Initially, people thought, well, what's the value of if they've recovered pots and arrowheads and stuff? You know, what is the commercial value of those items? And we can derive an estimate of damage that way. Well, the problem is that you're invariably looking into the black market to derive values. And those values can be very variable and they can change, and it just is kind of a slippery business. So the archaeologists that put together ARPA, and particularly the regs, archaeological value is determined by basically the cost of excavating, analyzing, and professionally reporting an excavation that's more or less commensurate with the size of the damage that was done to an archaeological site. Sounds like kind of abstract, and assistant U.S. attorneys kind of struggle with that, but it actually works pretty well. Now, this doesn't mean you just go out and measure a hole and say, well, you know, it cost us about $5,000 to test an archaeological site. Therefore, you actually have to build a data recovery plan, and you have to do, you know, how many professional archaeologists would be working, how many radiocarbon dates. So you have to do a ton of work in site damage assessments to get to the archaeological value, but it's a key piece. So we use archaeological value plus the cost of restoration or repair, which means putting the site back to bed, whether it's backfilling, putting in a layer of sand or putting down boards or plastic so you can distinguish the looted area from the intact deposit. And so you combine those values together to derive an assessment of the damage done. And then that in turn reveals the significance of the offense. As you can see, if it's under $500 in first offense, it's still pretty severe, but not more than 1 year and up to 100,000, which seems like a lot of money to me. But how many archaeological projects do you guys know that go for $500 or less? I can't think of any. That's barely gas in a truck and getting 2 people out and back on a day. So usually the archaeological values range in the thousands upon thousands of dollars. Now, a real important but underused part of ARPA is that it contains civil provisions. And the late, great Deb Barner on the Umpqua really was the real person that really first got this going in Oregon. Basically, archaeologists who are so upset about sites being disturbed, whether it's a guy out pot hunting and digging up a site or a bulldozer and a timber sail running over an archaeological site, that we want to criminalize everything. We want to find a bad guy, get justice. We want to be vindictive. But in fact, a lot of times archaeological disturbance happens inadvertently. Sometimes it happens under the old rubric of it's either easier to ask for forgiveness than permission. But nonetheless, though that kind of criminal intent is hard to determine or hard to prove, very frustrating. So instead of criminalizing every sort of inadvertent damage to sites or actual deliberate but disguised as inadvertent, you can use the civil provisions of ARPA, and you can see why it's such a more useful tool. There's a lower burden of proof. There's protocols and procedures where the restitution, once you do a damage assessment, goes right back into the site, and it's used very effectively. And so in the case of the top photo, that's on the Umpqua, and that's a road for a power line, and they blasted through a site. And rather than fiddling around trying to determine if these guys really intended to do that, or if they did it and we need to move on. And so I think Deb got $20,000 out of these guys. And I think there was probably the energy company wasn't happy about that. And theoretically, that's enough deterrence to keep them from doing it again. The bottom photo is a trail project where, again, damage was done, and money was basically garnered through the civil ARPA provisions to get the site restored, actually do some excavation to find out really fully what was there. So it's a cool but probably underused tool. So here quickly is a very quick sample of some of the ARPA, NAGPRA, and Oregon statute convictions and sentences in Oregon, beginning, what I'm familiar with, is I want to emphasize, beginning in 1985, which is a case that I was involved in. It was the first ARPA case, successful ARPA case in Oregon, and one of the first in the country, all the way to 2017. And you can see the variability in the kinds of sentencing that was delivered by the federal judge. But sometimes archaeologists, again, we want to get, our ounce of fat out of this, and we kind of get frustrated by the amount of penalty involved. But I've sat through any number of sentencings, and I can tell you very clearly that judges take this very seriously. I've been in a court where a guy with manslaughter, vehicular manslaughter, he was given a sentence that was not too much greater than Mr. Austin received and Mr. Fields received. So I think we're probably getting fair play under federal sentencing guidelines. But most archaeologists really, would like to take the guy or gal and put him in jail and lock him away for 1,000 years. But, that's not going to happen. But I can assure you that, these convictions are taken very, very seriously. Archaeologists play an important role in site vandalism and looting. It's a very prescribed role. It's a role, if you were hired on in the Forest Service, like I was in the early 1980s, or actually in the late 1970s, this was a role that you probably couldn't even imagine. It was get out there and go get those timber sales cleared or roads cleared or whatever. That was the job. But like so much, archaeologist's job has really changed over the last half a decade, or I should say half century. But the first thing is, the most important job is that we do site damage assessments. We process and document seized collections, advise U.S. attorneys and law enforcement, testify in court, and then those things that come in the 1988 amendments involving public participation programs, survey and monitoring. That's what archaeologists do. The special agents and the U.S. Attorney's Office, they really handle the criminal elements and loose lips, sink ships, and ARPA cases. So, a lot of times this information is not even privy to the archaeologist that is involved in the case. One thing I really want to stress is early on, there was this idea that we could go out there with scoping glasses and find pot hunters digging in the open, digging those sites. And if we did enough surveillance, we would invariably catch people. That really hasn't happened very often. We might catch somebody out trying to pick up an arrowhead and sight them under the theft of government property. But so what we've done, the Forest Service in particular, but also the BLM, is do undercover operations where we use undercover cops to get to know collectors, to find out where they're looting, and go on and do search and seizures. And from that, massive collections are always amassed. And, those have led to the most successful ARPA prosecutions in the United States and under NAGPRA too. So this is a table, wide angle lens, but you can see the amount of stuff that comes from a search and seizure. I've been on several search and seizures. They're kind of scary, weird things. Archaeologists sit in the background until the cops have gone in and it's safe, but then you go in and help identify what is of archaeological interest and so on. And I've been into some really scary trailers in Bend, Oregon, where there's tar heroin, meth, pot, the whole ball of wax. Invariably, there's guns, arms, and so on. So it's kind of a scary business, but that's what archaeologists sometimes are asked to do to help prosecute archaeological thieves. Of course, what we inevitably face is that, in the United States, artifact collecting has a time-honored past as both a hobby and a recreational pastime. And like I say, you can go out on the internet and you can get any number of artifact magazines, collectors magazines, books that really reinforce that. And these are two quotes that I just grabbed, but there's any number of them that you can find with a quick Google search. The point is that this has served as an effective, an effective cover for the more serious collecting and digging that goes on. When I grew up in Montana, there were lots of people, neighbors that were out there collecting artifacts. Nobody cared. Certainly the Forest Service didn't, or the BLM. Back in the day in the 1960s. And so there were lots of people, mom and pops collectors, and they truly exist. But that kind of collecting activity has also covered up for the more serious collecting that's gone on. And as cited in, David and wonderful paper with Pat and Dan, that if you haven't read about the origins of OAS and the whole Oregon Collection Project, it's really worth reading. And I really love the quote that he said, "There's no elephant in the room." And it doesn't matter if you're Ohio, Montana, Oregon, the genesis of the archaeological societies in those states was derived from artifact collecting, and collectors that had a passion and interest in Indian artifacts often watched them being destroyed by the activities of the Army Corps of Engineers, the Forest Service. They went out and collected them. And so there's that history has a long and important one, which is documented. And that's now resulted in more professionalization of broader public ethos. And of course, whether it's the MAS in Montana or OAS, you guys are making significant contributions to archaeological research, really important contributions. But it was seeded in this time-honored past of collecting in the United States. But there is another reality. And this was the reality that I faced. Honestly, I don't think I ever met a really nice artifact collector while I worked in Bend, Oregon. Most of them that I dealt with kind of lived on the marginal side of the community. The drugs were involved, like I say, serious drugs, not just a little pot. Firearms, inevitably, there are histories of game poaching, theft. They target human remains, don't care, and lots of times prior arrests and convictions. Sometimes the collecting community, the hobby community, thinks that this is kind of overwrought. In fact, you can look in the Bend Bulletin or Oregonian and various responses by the collecting community from the different busts that have happened since the 1980s. And this scenario to them seems like we've made it up out of whole cloth. But in truth, the successful ARPA convictions that have happened have largely been with people that are not necessarily the best citizens in their communities. And I can tell you personally, you know, when I was there, I've gotten threats. My wife has gotten threats. Very unpleasant exchange with collectors in the community and so on. This is very uncomfortable business dealing with this crowd. I was talking with the current, or she's soon moving on, I believe she's in the regional office, but Penny was talking about on the Deschutes, you know, when she walked into ARPA, and it was one of the less fun parts of her job. It was a tough introduction. So when you tackle archaeological looting, you really have to be aware that you're kind of often dealing with the seedier side of life. There's been all kinds of papers and academic tomes written about, you know, what motivates collectors and so on. And I've just put down a handful. They're pretty obvious. What are the most motivated by commercial interest, amassing a big collection, or just that going out on the weekend? The biggest thing is the perceived risk and seriousness of the activity and getting caught. And in my experience, most of the folks that I've dealt with, they don't give a rip. The risk is, the reward is definitely outweighs the risk. Of course, the big thing is site access, availability. Where's the site? Oftentimes the sites are off in the targeted sites, one of the most remote places of a national forest or BLM land or a state park. But oftentimes looted sites are hidden in plain view. They're right there in the community's backyard. So there's no real pattern as far as I've been able to determine what gets looted or what doesn't. And sometimes a lot of these people are hopped up on meth. It's like, let's go out and dig a site. Let's go do this. Let's go party. And so they head off up to Tumalo outside of Bend, and that's where they go, and they end up digging a site. The final thing is just the amount of local deterrence, whether there's signage, how much monitoring, how much agency or site steward presence is there. And that can make a big difference. And in interview after interview that I've read or participated in, you know, the perpetrators always cite, oh man, I saw that patrol out there. We weren't going to go there. So it doesn't really take much to kind of deter people from getting out there and doing the thing, but you have to make that effort. There's been a whole cottage industry about writing about whether signage it works or doesn't. I fall into the signage camp. If you have an ARPA sign or a site protection sign posted on a tree and somebody is caught digging there, there's no further need for proof of intent. It's right there. They know they were digging a cultural site. But if you delve into the literature, it's kind of very fascinating. The whole vandalism, depreciative behavior, whether it's archaeological sites or whether it's shooting up Forest Service outhouses or burning them down, it runs the gamut, but they all address these kinds of factors that I've identified. Of course, these people that are out digging things up, as I said, they sometimes operate with kind of a different reality. Some of them think they're Indiana Jones. Some of them, they think they're actually doing serious science. Some don't care at all. But all of them are operating, I think, in the United States under sort of the post-colonial worldview of indigenous peoples, that it's marginal, it doesn't matter, who cares? And since anthropology and Native American history until recently was not taught in our community schools at the primary, secondary levels, I mean, oftentimes the only exposure you get to Native American cultures in any meaningful way is a college course. That is now changing, but it creates kind of a thought experiment for a lot of people that either the Indians really didn't matter, or in the case of our current Netflix star, all of this cool stuff, the mounds, the rock art, were all the creation of an alien species, rather a culture, rather than North American Indians. So, we also have, in terms of convincing the public, the media, that, Native American history is a legitimate part of our society, our culture, our narrative, our human narrative in North America. Here's some prevention strategies. Again, there's a veritable cottage industry of information about this. These are painfully obvious: public education, tribal engagement. When I first started, we would contact the tribes about looting, but that was about it. Or we would get a quotable quote and the tribes would then kind of go away. And now we work with, hand in foot all the time on archaeological looting cases, and they're key to that. Media exposure is really good, getting the message out, public education. Again, I keep repeating this non-Section 106 work that is so important to do and often gets so neglected. And then training and cooperative law enforcement and reporting of incidents, so that we have some quantitative and not qualitative or anecdotal knowledge of site looting in Oregon and in North America and worldwide. And there's some fascinating literature on this if you're into this stuff. So in closing, I have just a few references. I don't have the full reference, but anybody that's interested in them and more, I would be happy to email you if you can even read that, my email address. But these are some of the articles that were really important in the early stages of kind of getting the message across. There's far more. If you haven't read Virginia Butler's article about the Dalles, boy, that should be a mandatory read. But there's lots of good stuff out there. The Killing Bones is about the Harrelson case, which is a wild, wild tale. It's an outdoor magazine or outside magazine. But I can send you a more comprehensive bibliography for anybody that's even nominally interested in this kind of stuff. And I can forward it on through Dave or through Jim at any time. So with that, I will close and open it up to observations, comments, questions.
All right. So over here in OMSI, it looks like we have a question right here in the front row. Go ahead.
Hi, how do you deal with the, how do you protect archaeology resources in on the beaches, like on the high and low tide zones? I can think of examples, about 2016. A couple found two Spanish silver coins, and a rockhound found a copper Spanish coin near Manzanita, or Oregon. How do you, should is the laws addressing that type of fine? How do you, should you think that laws should be adjusted for that kind of environment where an artifact can appear because the ocean and the tides uncover it and exposed, and in a couple hours it's gone? Should there be some law or something, fact that somebody, what about picking up that artifact before it's gone? I don't know. Is there, what's your opinion on that?
Well, I think the first thing is it depends if it's, again, a random coin that is just kind of lost, somebody, a shipwreck at sea, or somebody walking along, versus something that is pouring out of an archaeological site. And, and the archaeological site is appearing and disappearing. In my experience on the Oregon coast, where I worked for a number of years, the shell middens were a bit like that. They would kind of come and go, but stuff would dribble out onto the beach. But those are bona fide sites on state land. I would have to say, way back in the day, we were being kindly harassed by the state SHPO about trying to put in a trail project near Cape Perpetua. And we happened to look down, and there was Oregon State Parks, who was actually, they had a big bulldozer backhoe, and they were moving around what was clearly a shell midden. And I called and said, this seems a little crazy. I mean, we're really trying to work hard to get this trail negotiated around this shell midden, but this archaeological property that is clearly state parks, you're allowing it to basically be bulldozed away. So I think to some extent, a lot of this kind of stuff is just doesn't go recognized where this stuff is, who's managing, who's on first. So the first thing would be to see if it's a bona fide site. But I don't know. I'd be interested. You guys, many of you have more experience than me. If there's an isolated coin out there that's drifted to shore, it's certainly, if it's, I don't know where it would be between high and low tide, under whose legal jurisdiction. That's actually a good question. So I'm just going to leave it at that unless anybody else wants to chime in.
All right. I don't think there's a lot of comments on that. All right. I got one more here in the crowd.
Carl, can
If
you turn
someone
off your PowerPoint?
I'm trying to figure out how. Here we go. Let's see. No, I don't want to do that.
There you go.
Yep.
Great. Thank you.
If someone got a permit to collect artifacts and then they took them home and something happened to that permit, and then you did a raid later, but they had collected them legally, how do you deal with that?
Are you guys trying to find the most complicated problems you can? If you have a permit, you assume you're a established archaeologist. If you take the material home and it disappears, you're responsible for that. Your permit says you have for the safekeeping of that artifact. If it's an accident, the house burns down, there's not much you can do about it. So, that's the best I can do on that one. I can't understand why there would be a raid on a person that's a bona fide archaeologist if they have the collection in their house, but maybe I'm missing something. It's late. It's almost 9 o'clock here.
Looks like somebody in the chat also mentioned that one of your early slides mentioned buttons and coins as being maybe exempt. So maybe that would answer part of the shipwreck sort of buttons issue and coins washing up on the beach. Also, there's another question in the chat. In your first slide, was that a group of looters surrounded by groundstone?
That was. And I'm not entirely sure that's a Deb Barner picture. I think it was from Mowich Cave collectors that dug down in the Rogue in that part of the world. And that's a photo that's been around. But yes, those are indeed pot hunters. Back in the day when collectors were very proud of their collections, they thought that there was nothing wrong with it. And I don't think these guys were shooting up meth and going out and digging sites. They were just out there having fun. But yeah, that's from, I believe it's Mowich Cave.
All right. And are there any more comments here in the crowd? I think we got one more over here.
How are collections that were collected long before these laws affected?
You know, that's a great question. And that's a great tie into what David and Dan and Pat are doing. You know, if it's past 19, if it's digging previous to 1979, you know, the ARPA law, you know, it's difficult to shoehorn the ARPA law in. So, you know, what I think what we're trying to do is to work with collectors that have these collections to get them to come forward in a variety of means and, you know, donate them to different museums, try and figure out like the Oregon State Museum, trying to figure out provenience, trying to figure out where, you know, exactly they came from, which is a really, really hard job. But there would be no criminal prosecutorial element at all. It's just, you know, if this stuff was done by your granddad back in the day or your dad, you know, the important stuff is to try and bring this to the fore. And, you know, I think that's working in Oregon probably better than a lot of places with your artifact fairs and all the good work you're doing. Probably less so in places like Montana. Maybe there's a red state, blue state element to that, but trying to get collectors to come forward. And I think that's the best way you can probably get collections that precede ARPA. You wouldn't involve any kind of criminal element. It would be very difficult. But you can still get the collections back, I think, if we work hard enough at it. And that's where avocational groups are so important, because I think you guys are an intermediary between the professionals, not that you aren't professional, but the credentialed archaeologists and people that have close connections to the larger community. So, you know, nobody's going to bust somebody for their dad dug up an old, well, a grave would be a little more problematic, but it's still getting the grave returned and reburied. But pre-1979, it's all about public goodwill.
All right. And also in the comments, how do Montana state laws compare with those of Oregon?
You know, the Montana law doesn't have the detail at all that the Oregon state law has. It's much briefer. It doesn't have necessarily the more strident criminal provisions that's spelled out so clearly in the Oregon law. You know, it is really, once again, in my view, it's really biased towards that unintentional site damage piece, you know, to do compliance on state lands and projects. And I think almost, you know, the elements that are so important in the Oregon law are less emphasized. That is the site protection aspect. They're different laws. Some laws are like, I think more progressive states, if I can carefully use that term, their laws are really complicated. Typically California, you know, you might need a translator to get through some of their convoluted stuff. You know, they take this very seriously. There's an old joke, there's an archaeologist behind every tree in California. You know, we don't have many trees out in the plains of Montana, so there's not that many archaeologists, but we don't have the kind of law that you do in Oregon.
All right. And I think I'll take the last question of the night over here.
Thank you. This is an actual site. I found this on an 1868 map. There are two sites. It's on the Oregon coast. And it's an estuary, and it's on county property. I've been working with, I've talked to Oregon SHPO. I reported to Oregon SHPO. They said that I was going to write a report on this. And also I've been in contact with Stacy Scott, State of Oregon State Parks, Coastal Region Archaeologist. I keep her informed of what I find. I did find one of the sites, the exact coordinates, the location of it, based on Google Earth and so forth. Now, this is county property. As far as notification, Oregon SHPO office would be the one that would notify the county that there is an archaeological site there. I've been told not to divulge the location to the county officials on this. Is it the Oregon SHPO office would be the one to notify the county that they have an archaeological resource there, or how does that work?
You know, again, I'm not familiar enough with the Oregon law. Again, you would have more expertise. I would think that it would be, if it were me, I would ask the Oregon SHPO to give the county officials a call and let them know that they have an archaeological site that they need to deal with. You know, I think that would certainly carry more force of weight than, you know, certainly somebody like you or I just calling in randomly saying, we're working on the site, we're trying to do what's right. But, you know, that would be my approach. I don't know that that's the right or the correct one.
All right. I thank you so much on behalf of everybody here. It's a fantastic talk. I don't want to. And thank you once again. We'll let you actually get to bed. I guess you said you're an hour later than us, so.
Yeah. Well, thanks again, everyone. Keep up the great work you're doing out there. This was wonderful.
Fantastic talk.
Thanks, Carl. We really appreciate you taking your time. Interesting stuff, and thanks again.
You betcha, Jim. You get better.
Thank you.
Thanks, Carl.
Good
Really
night.
enjoyed it.
You betcha, David. Take care.
All right, I'll be in touch.
All right. And I'll see everybody next month, February 7th, with Dr. Jeffrey Smith from the University of Nevada, talking about research in the Northern Great Basin. Thank you, everybody, and have a great night.